welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 63. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is the author of debut novel The Midnight House, a historical mystery told from 3 third-person perspectives, including a present-day main character. Tracy Rees calls it evocative, intriguing, and beautifully written. Hello, Amanda Geard.
Hi, Charlie. Thanks a million for having me on.
It's great to have you here. How are you?
I'm good. It's been a couple of weeks since publication, so I'm kind of settling into the groove of being an author. It's been a really great journey.
And say for listeners, we're talking in May, but I know this is out in June, so it has been a couple of weeks here. This is your debut novel, and from what I'm reading and finding out about you, your career is in geology, and you've travelled the world as a geologist and lived in loads of different places. Can you tell us about your background and what came before writing?
Yeah, I'm a geologist by training, more in the side of exploration geology. So what that involves often is crawling around unexplored places, exploring them, making maps and testing all the rocks to sort of see what's there. And then, at the other end of that's often liaising with governments to gain access to areas. So I've worked across the Middle East and Africa and did quite a bit of work in Australia as well, where I'm originally from.
And, geology, you don't necessarily think about writing novels. Have you always wanted to be a writer? Where did this come in?
Yeah, it's a good question. Something like I've been thinking about lately because people have been asking me. And, at school, I did quite a lot of creative writing, but, it wasn't one of those things when you go and sit down with the careers counsellor, they say, oh, yep, writing novels, that's something that we'd recommend because obviously it's it can be a difficult career to get into. So I had always gone with my father over to the western coast of Tasmania, where I'm from. He wasn't a geologist, but he knew everything about the geology. There's a strong mining history from the area. And we used to spend time sort of exploring all these old exploration sites. And I decided that I wanted to continue doing that as a career. And that's what I ended up doing. But while I was out in these remote places, remote camps, would be out, for example, in the Gabonese jungle, working away in a remote camp for a month or so at a time, you'd have very long evenings. And I picked up a bit of writing then, and I actually started writing some non-fiction, just articles for magazines on topics I was interested in, not necessarily geology, but also including that. And so I just did that off my own back. And then it wasn't until 2019, I'd been living in County Kerry here in Ireland for a few years by then. And I saw a flyer for Writers' Week. I thought, what is this Writers' Week where writers go and gather? I think I was in a pub at the time. I probably had a couple of glasses of wine. So I took a photo of the flyer and I headed off as a couple of hours to go to Listowel. And I sat in a book launch. It was Patricia O'Reilly's book, The First Rose of Tralee. She was brilliant. And somebody asked her a question about her manuscript. Someone in the audience put up her hand and said, oh, I've had some encouragement from an agent. And I looked at this woman asking the question, and she looked pretty normal. And I thought, wow, she's written a book. And I don't know who the woman was, but she really inspired me. And that evening in 2009, I came home and pulled all my favorite books off the shelf, which are all these multi-timeline, time slip books, you might call them. And I took a box of tabs from my drawer and tabbed up all the key points in the books, all the timelines and the turning points, and pulled apart very scientifically. So I would say it was the science of fiction, but not confused with science fiction. I pulled these books apart and started to plan my own book. So that's sort of the crux of how it went. And I sat down to start writing, not really thinking I would ever send it out to anyone. And the rest is history, I suppose.
So you have planned this book quite meticulously then? There's a lot of planning that's gone throughout the book?
It was very, very planned, but not to say that I stuck to the plan the whole way. But I am quite envious of pantsers, people who can write by the seat of their pants. So I did plan it, but certainly a lot of the characters changed along the way, and a lot of what I like to think of as the sort of richness and the extra the extra subplots of the timelines kind of wove their way in as I was writing.
Okay. And you said about the books on your shelves, you said time slip there. Now, The Midnight House isn't a time slip, but might there be one in your future?
No, I think I'll stick with the Midnight House sort of multi-timeline genre, but some into the vernacular, some people call them these time slips, but I should clarify there's no time travel. So we'll call it a multi-timeline book. But I certainly have a lot of those on my shelf, all of the Kate Morns and plenty of Lucinda Riley's, Santa Montefiore, and of quite a few people you've had a chat to, Liz Fenwick and Hazel Gaynor and Nicola Cornick, and all these writers are all my favourites. So I do love the genre.
Fair enough. So, The Midnight House sees 21st century Ellie down on her luck, back from Dublin to her mother's house in County Kerry. She finds a letter in a second-hand book that starts her on a quest to solve the mystery of a high-born woman called Charlotte, who in 1940 supposedly drowned in a lake. Amanda, should we get straight to your reading?
We will. I'm actually going to read the prologue today because a lot of the novel has a lot set primarily in County Kerry, although we have Blitz London in there as well. I feel that most of the novel should be read in a lilting Irish accent, which obviously I haven't got. So I'm going to read the prologue. The house, it said, was once a great ring fort, piled purple stones placed with such precision that its smooth wall, a perfect circle, rose from the earth without a sliver of mortar to hold it together. It saw the arrival of the Bronze Age, the passing of the Iron Age, the coming of Christianity to this emerald isle on the edge of the tumbling Atlantic Ocean. Its stones, they say, were moved one by one by rough tenant hands into a new shape, a rectangle, all evidence of curving geometry lost. More stones were added, taken from the base of the mountain that towers behind, and cool blue slate, at dawn it turns to warm magenta, was brought from Valentia Island, where it was cleft in neat, regular slivers, its smooth scales forming a weatherproof skin, the veins lined with lead. To delay decay, local timber was shunned. Even beams made from the slow-grown oaks of Ireland's woodlands could not compete with the rich, resinous pitch pine shipped across the ocean. The walls, held together with mortar, unlike the fort from which they are said to have been pulled, were given a sheath, alkaline powder mixed with the inky waters of the loch. Even back then, ivy crept from the wooded surrounds, reaching eagerly towards the new walls with curious fingers. The gardeners would cut it back year after year, but still it came. Once the house was watertight, work on the inside began. Green Connemara marble fashioned into fireplaces, quarry tiles imported from 1,000 miles east, hand-painted silks unfurled from the Orient. Countless sash windows peered from the elevation like sentinels. They were eyes on the world, and when they blinked, they let in fresh Kerry air rolling damp from the ocean below. Over the years, the house was added to, extended piece by piece, a wing here, a boiler room there, a hall for the servants at the back. Each postscript tied in by new layers of that blue, then magenta slate. There were times when the chimneys puffed white peaty smoke. There were times when they didn't. Generations came and went, malevolent landlords, benevolent landlords, absent landlords, and their children too. Ireland fought for freedom, the old order tumbled, and Blackwater Hall survived, but it could yet disappear, because ring forts disappear, houses disappear, people disappear.
Thank you. We've got the title, and I was wondering when or like how, why, etc. you came to title it The Midnight House as you did.
That's a good question. Actually, the novel, because it is very much about this beautiful young Anglo-Irish aristocrat, Charlotte Rathmore, I had titled it Finding Charlotte when I sent it out to agents and to the publishers. And then for a short time, it was called The Secrets of Blackwater Hall. But at some point fairly close to publication, there was a name change that came from the publisher, and they sent it at the same time as the cover, which I really love. It's very beautiful. And they'd put that on the cover, and I said, yes, that's exactly it. So I have to give all credit to the publisher for that. I think it fit the book brilliantly.
That's interesting because, yeah, I mean, something else that's partly in this discussion, I suppose. You've got a very strong element theme of the women in the novel and the characters itself. You know, it's very character driven. But you have also got the house, Blackwater Hall, in there all the time. Whereabouts on the scale of importance does the house itself fall amongst the characterisation, the plot itself, etc.?
Yeah, well, the house was always there, whereas I'd say some of the characters sort of morphed and changed and evolved. Whereas the house, I had pictured it from the beginning, and it's not based on any particular house, but it is drawn from two inspirations. The first was the house we recently moved that we lived in. It wasn't the size and the grandeur of Blackwater Hall, but it was a big old house here on the coast in County Kerry that we came across on a holiday, about 7 years ago, and we were driving around the Ring of Kerry, and it's very beautiful around here. And we were driving around a bend, and this big old house sort of loomed up, and we paused, and there was an old for sale sign on it. It was leaning that you almost imagined the letters falling off onto the ground. It had been there a while. And there was a phone number which we could just make out. And this was with my husband, and one of us, I can't remember who, called the number. And by the next day, we were walking through the doors to have a viewing of this house, and it was broadly derelict. So we ended up moving in, and we had a huge project ahead of us. So when I wrote that prologue, I just read, it, again, not quite the grandeur, but very much was how that house was built, from the sort of pitch pine shipped across the ocean and all this plaster and lime. So the fabric of the house came from that. And then the second influence was really trying to understand how the house survived in Ireland, survived the 20s, when most houses of that size and importance didn't make it through that time. So I was reading it up a lot on sort of the big house, the Irish big house, and came across quite a few, not many, but a few that had survived because the landlords, they were good landlords to a certain extent. They were interested in their tenants. And of course, when the famine came along, some of them mortgaged their estates to provide food and also passage to the US for their tenants to get out. And that's where a lot of the backstory of Blackwater Hall came from, that comes through the novel, through the history of the Stack family there and Neve's family. Those two prongs propped up Blackwater Hall. And then in terms of how it looked, I fell in love with a picture of Delphi Lodge, which is a big old manor up in Galway that sat on a lake. And so that was the manor in my mind when I was writing the descriptions of Blackwater Hall.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating to know. And you mentioned the house that you and your husband looked at, and you bought it, you renovated it, etc.?
We did, yes. It was a big job. And we did most of the work ourselves. There was about 5 years there where we didn't have a weekend, so it was some job. But we had also a lot of local help, and just the most amazing community. Hopefully you can feel it in the Midnight House. Not that Ballin is, the local village, but we fell in love with the people as much as the landscape and the house. But yes, we did. We renovated it all. The next door neighbours, actually, their family had owned it about 1894 through to the 70s. So we learned quite a bit about the background of the house, and it was just a bit big for us for upkeep and all of that. So a wonderful family have bought it and loving living there. And when we're about 20 kilometres down the road now.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, you can see it grow further and everything like that.
Yeah, it was a great experience. It was a big job, and I'm not sure what I'd do it again, but it was wonderful living in a house where you kind of felt history seep from the walls. And that's, I think that about Blackwater Hall, that, secrets hide in the walls. Now, did the house we renovated have secrets? Well, there were a few, we found out, but not as delicious as a sort of missing woman.
No, wonderful. You said there about the community while you were renovating the house and everything about that. And that's something that is very apparent in the novel. You have got these people in the community in Ballin they're there all the time, and they're very secondary characters, but it really, really works in your book that they are constantly there. So was this always important from the get-go?
It was, I'd say it was just vital. I could see the village and the village life. I wanted to capture the warmth that my husband's British ever since. And everyone's been amazing here welcoming us both. You're obviously people coming into Ireland called blow-ins, and so we'll always be blow-ins, but I'd rather be a blow-in than not sort of a blown here at all. I wanted to gather that warmth because we had these, amazing experiences when we arrived, in terms of people already knowing we were here, of course. So I was telling you about calling the number to view the big old house, and the next morning we were walking on the Kerry Way, and a farmer came over to us and said, "Oh, it's going to be great to have some lights on in the old house again." We hadn't even looked at it. So there was that sense of being known, and I wanted to capture some of that, but also the heartwarming things that happened. We were sat in the house a couple of months after arriving. There was wind, it was Christmas, and there was wind coming through the windows, and there was a tiny potbelly stove we were huddled around, and a blue tractor we'd seen drive up and down the road just pulled in, did a 5-point turn and sort of upped his load and then left. And we were like, "What's this about?" And raced down the front, and he'd left a load of logs there for us, chopped logs, and just gone. It was just a gift to welcome us. And we later got to know the farmer and his wife, and we're now godparents to one of their sons. And, it's just that sort of community where there's just a great welcome. And I wanted that feeling of Ellie Fitzgerald coming back from Dublin, from the big city. Obviously, she's had sadness and disappointment and trauma. And I wanted her to recognize some of that, recognize the warmth by the end. And in fact, well before the end of the book, that feeling of coming home, which we my husband and I always feel here, even though, it wasn't the place that we grew up.
But no, it's great to hear all this story and the backstory and, about the community. And you've got this story and these narratives from these women, it's very women driven. Can you tell us about your women characters here? Nancy, Charlotte, Ellie, Hattie, whatever you'd like to say to introduce them to us.
Okay, well, yes, as you said, the novel was told from 3 points of view. So we have Charlotte Rathmore, and the novel isn't told from her point of view. I'll come back to that. So she's an Anglo-Irish girl. She's really struggling to find her own identity, and she's living here in County Kerry in this big old Blackwater Hall. And we have Nancy Rathmore, who's Charlotte's sister-in-law, married to her brother Teddy. And Nancy's life is forever altered by the Blitz. So we have the 1940s timeline told from her point of view. And we have Hattie Rathmore, who's Nancy's daughter. And Hattie's timeline is told through 1958, where herself and her family return from the UK to live at Blackwater Hall because Teddy has inherited the hall. And Hattie can't really understand why her mother doesn't want to return there at all. And then, of course, we have Ellie Fitzgerald in modern timeline, 2019. And she, as I mentioned before, is returning home from Dublin. And so you have the sense of all these women returning, except for Charlotte Rathmore, whose point of view we don't have, but she's always on the page. She is very much a Rebecca, sort of Daphne du Maurier. She's there in the walls and she's in everyone's mind, whether it's Ellie trying to trace what on earth happened to her, or whether it's Nancy and their strong friendship tying them together even when Charlotte isn't around, or whether it's Hattie wondering who this Aunt Charlotte is and why no one will ever talk about her.
And she's also a very nice Rebecca. She's not at all like
Yeah.
You said that, and I was thinking at the time, and I thought, but at the same time, we should probably say, she's a very nice character, Charlotte.
Yeah, we should clarify that. Definitely.
So, I mean, you do obviously explore Charlotte's story through the other characters, the results, that the way that their own stories have been influenced by Charlotte's and her life. But if I can just hone in on Ellie for a moment, why was it important to explore Charlotte's story through Ellie's, or maybe was it the other way around for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I should go back a step and say that Ellie's story started actually. Well, I'm a bit of a charity shop fiend. I love I love digging through charity shops. And in the first of Ellie's chapters, when she's returned back to Kerry, she goes to the local charity shop and picks up a book, an Agatha Christie, and between the pages, she finds a letter written by Charlotte, and that's sort of what leads her to walk and eventually run into this investigation into finding out what happened to Charlotte. So I've never found a letter in a book from a charity shop, but I have found various bits and pieces, an old lace bookmark that I found in a Mrs. Beeton I picked up that someone had obviously handmade and used for years in this book, and little notes that have been in coat pockets and things like that. And I really wanted a modern day character to find something and then do what I'd never managed to do, which was to find out what that item meant and where it came from and the origin of it. So I don't think there's any other doubt there was going to be an Ellie Fitzgerald story. And when it came to creating her, she just sort of wandered. She just sort of wandered onto the page, I have to say. And I love this idea of someone, because I'm sort of a rural girl at heart, I love this idea of someone returning from the cities, of having embraced it and coming home to recognize the value of living in a smaller community.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, we'll go back to Ellie in a minute. I've got a bit more about Charlotte. Obviously, we talked about the house. And I mean, I don't want to ask, is there a basis in history of Charlotte's story? Because obviously there's lots of elements that there are, obviously. But were there any other furthering influences historically, or any particular, I suppose, stories that you found that worked for Charlotte's story?
I would say that Charlotte's completely a figment of my imagination. She kind of walked with me for quite a while, this concept of a woman having gone missing in a lake. We're having spoilers, so having have it made appear that she goes missing in a lake. I sort of remember seeing this character years ago. I'm not really sure where she came from, but I became kind of vested in her journey, and I mean that literally. When I started to think, how can a woman escape her really confined upbringing here in County Kerry and get away in the 40s? It would have been very difficult to travel incognito across Ireland at that time. So I actually got in touch with a few historians and discussed this kind of journey she would have taken and the papers she would have needed and how difficult it would have been. There was one time where I thought, I might have to give up on this because it was so difficult to get her to the UK. But as the challenges mounted for me to get her there, I felt more and more strongly that her story had to be in the novel and that she had to get away because it was quite difficult. I could see how it would be. So, I mean, in terms of history, I'd say that all the characters are very much a figment of my imagination, but I'm always finding tidbits in newspapers or the chronicles, of Britain and Ireland, and picking up local books. I love reading sort of local histories. So there's always something in there that weaves into their characters.
Yeah, that's interesting, the history and your interest in local history, which is interesting in itself. And something I noticed with the writing was you're quite open with a lot of the details about what's happened to Charlotte, almost throughout the book, with us readers. It takes the characters a longer time. It's quite easy to find out, which was interesting, but it really, really works how you've done it. And something that I did want to ask was the mystery of Charlotte's disappearance itself important, or more so the subject of it?
It was really about the subject. You've definitely picked up on that. And, I think it's quite interesting when people have been getting in touch these last couple of weeks. Everybody picks a different character that they identify with. But a lot of most people say it's a story of Nancy and Charlotte and their friendship. And, I think the disappearance adds a certain element of suspense. But I was really interested in investigating this friendship, quite new friendship between two women who weren't really able to find their place in the world. Charlotte obviously wasn't sure whether she was English or Irish or American. Her mother, Neve, is is a sort of new-moneyed American who's been married off here in Ireland. And then there's Nancy, who's married into this aristocratic family and isn't welcomed at all. But herself and her husband, Teddy, have tried to make their own lives. And that of course, works up until 1958 when Hugo, the older brother, dies and Teddy's got to take up the reins. And just looking at how that extreme change in Nancy's life as well alters everything for them, for the whole family, and actually has ramifications right through to the modern day.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned Hugo there. God, this sounds awful with characters, doesn't it? But I'm glad he wasn't in the novel fully. He was quite a character, and he's seen off as such. And as a reader, that was quite nice. With Ellie, you are, I suppose, slower than we are with Charlotte's mystery. We find out about what's happened with her a lot slower. Was this something that was in your planning? What was the reason for this, effectively?
Now, are you talking about her personal, the personal side of Ellie's story, or professional side, or both?
Both, Dylan and the journalism.
Well, the journalism was in there from day one, and the reason was, it's over here, it's moved to the top of the news, the sort of housing crisis. But at the time I started writing it, I wanted Ellie to be someone who was writing about housing, because I could see this was becoming a really, really big issue, particularly in Dublin. I already knew that I wanted sort of an evil councillor and, a big vulture fund man. And I wanted her to have these professional issues that revolved around her writing, on an issue with housing. So that was there. And in terms of Dylan, certainly there was always this sense that she would have a broken relationship. And then I think the sort of miscarriage came along later. And, it wasn't actually until one of the last drafts that I wrote the scene of Ellie and her mother bird watching, or so-called bird watching, just on the coast there of County Kerry. Although I knew she had a miscarriage, I wasn't sure how she would tell her mum. And initially she didn't tell her for a long time in the novel. And I brought that forward because I felt the reader needed to know why she was reluctant, and also why, when she had discovered Nancy's miscarriage, that she felt a sense of connection between the two women, across the 80 years there. So it was very much her coming together from a base character of Ellie, a journalist, a housing scandal, through to a broken relationship and this miscarriage. And I wanted to convey in the book just how difficult it is for women to talk about that, and for her mum, who you don't often get this sense of miscarriage in our mother's generation, to sit there with these binoculars around her chest and this flask of Bernie's homemade wine. I wanted them to have this sense of really opening up and talking that often doesn't happen enough.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm going to dart back to Charlotte for a moment, but with the introduction with Ellie as such. When Ellie finds out Charlotte didn't die, which comes before Nancy's narrative tells us as such, there's obviously this idea that she might still be alive. And what you do is very interesting, because it shows you your own kind of assumptions and how to think about that differently. But was this idea of her still being alive, was that something you had considered having at all?
Sure, I hadn't. And at the end, because I got to know Charlotte, I wish she was alive. I admit that. And I do wish that. But at the same time, that's not how life goes. And I think that possibly if we'd been able to find Charlotte at the end, which is obviously why the original title, Finding Charlotte, probably wouldn't have fitted quite right, it would have been very satisfying. But you would have lost the richness of Nancy's secret. Ultimately, something very drastic had to happen for Nancy to pretend that Albert was in fact her and Teddy's son. So you really did need that catalyst to snowball on the rest of the novel, and therefore also the dramatic, events that happen at the end of the 1958 timeline.
Are you saying about everything snowballing there? I mean, that's something also, which is kind of why I asked the question earlier, that, you do give people the information quickly, which lulls you into a false sense of security that you're going to reveal the end bits. And that's why it works so well, I think, because, you do have these two bits that actually I don't think you do see coming. I mean, maybe some people do, but it's not too evident or anything. So it's something you'd have to think about as a possible idea rather than a real prediction. And talking about Charlotte, and you've mentioned it yourself, so we'll kind of cycle back to it. You've got the epilogue. Didn't expect that at all. It ends on her being free, which has a poignant feeling to it, especially in terms of what Ellie had been talking about with Milo beforehand. Why did you include this epilogue? Why was Charlotte included like this?
Do you know, it felt right because Charlotte had died, and it was terribly sad. She's such a bright light. And finishing the last chapter on Blackwater Hall, it felt nice, but it wasn't quite done. And the reason was that I wanted the reader to remember Charlotte fondly. I think that sense that although she died young, in that short time, she really lived for it. And I thought that was a nice sort of sentiment to finish on there, that Charlotte Rathmore had been almost locked up at Blackwater Hall and tried her best to be free. And finally, she'd sort of sprung out, and she was doing finally what she wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing she does do, if I can put this in here, is she becomes a Canary Girl. She works with the chemicals for the war in Britain. Do you know, did a lot of pregnant women do that sort of job at the time?
There were some, and I mentioned earlier about some historians I talked to, and one of them here in Ireland had known, about some pregnant women who'd carried on being Canary Girls during World War II. And I got quite a lot of information from him. I say a lot of information, but I didn't actually put that much information in the book about, and certainly none from Charlotte's point of view of the day-to-day life of being a Canary Girl. But it's a bit like that, where you do all this research and then you kind of close the book, your notebook, and put it aside, and whatever naturally filters onto the page, you let it come so that the reader isn't being bombarded. There was certainly precedent for pregnant women working in these factories up to a certain point. And during that time, anything sort of went, But as I highlight in the book, a lot of women did leave London, midway through pregnancy. But a lot of the time they returned because the homes that were set up for not lying in as such, a bit late for that, but for them to carry on their pregnancy just weren't suitable. So a lot of the time they did return to London to their jobs, which was quite remarkable, really. I might just throw something in there about the Canary Girls as well. That was sort of precipitated by Charlotte needing to travel on Tabby's identification, which was leading back to all these discussions I was having with these historians about how to get someone over to the UK or to England during the war, and needing to already have a permit to work. So, of course, Tabby was a village girl, and generally they would have got a permit to go over and work as a Canary Girl. So that was sort of how that happened. But what I loved about Charlotte was that she sort of took it on, and at the end of each day she said, "Oh, this is the first time I've ever done any real work, and I love the ache in my feet." And that I think made me really love the character of Charlotte.
No, that's good to add. And I mean, you said about Tabby, I mean, she's a delight. And actually, you've just made me think there, if Charlotte had lived, I suppose we could say, how do you imagine her life of going? Would she have got back to Thomas? Would she have carried on working? What would you say would happen?
I would imagine that Thomas would have gone to London, and then they would have moved to the countryside and started a new life. That's what I like to think.
That's a lovely conceptual ending, I suppose you could say.
Yeah.
So you've got Milo. I know I haven't really brought him in, but he's Albert's son. The house and the title of the baronetcy is going to go to him. But at the end, he's looking at working on the house. And we know already that he's not keen on the idea of the peerage. But what's going to happen with the peerage and the house, would you say?
Although they've been the peerage and the house have been separated, and Nancy's worked hard at that. We don't see that on the page, but it's mentioned by Harriet in the modern day. What's going to happen? Well, I think that Milo's going to step into it, but I don't think that it's going to be, the house is going to be a huge part of his life and Ellie's life, I think, going forward. But I think the peerage is just one of these things that is now on paper and, not going to affect him in the slightest. But I like to see them remaining in Ballin. I like to see Ellie there at Blackwater Hall, perhaps writing a book, let's say, and Milo as a strong part of the community.
That's one thing, you were very, very good at setting up some red herrings for a romance and making us think about Milo. And I was like, it's possible. Is that going to happen? Then, yeah, no, it was good. If we leave that specific book conversation there, I asked you if you've got a time slip in your future and you're saying, you like time slip, but you're more like the narratives in the history and stuff. Can I ask you, what is next with your writing? What are you writing at the moment?
I am writing another book in the same vein, and it's got two settings that are close to my heart. One is County Kerry, of course, and the other one is Tasmania, where I was born. And at the start of this chat, I was telling you about going to the West Coast and fossicking. And, I learned a lot about the settlement history of the West Coast of Tasmania. So at this point, probably can't say too much because I'm sure it will change, but at this point, I have a very large, rickety old house on the west coast of Tasmania, and two evacuees from World War II from London who go to Tasmania. One of them is going to her family, and the other one's her chaperone, who we say. And only one of the women, as they are 6 years later, rather than girls, only one of them returns. And County Kerry is woven in there through a love interest.
All right. No, that sounds good. And yeah, you've got the mystery element there, and we're going further afield. And very exciting, definitely. So, Amanda, is there anything else that we may have missed or we haven't covered enough or anything like that you'd like to end to the end of this podcast?
I've really, really enjoyed talking to you because I haven't revisited the characters for a little while, I have to admit, because it's such a long route to publication. But I think the only thing I want to add is it's just been so nice having this conversation and hearing from readers. It's kind of been remarkable when people get in touch and say they identified with someone or they loved this part of the story, or a lot of the time just tales of someone's grandparents during the war and they mention how life was for them, say, in the Blitz. So I just love those little connections, and I think that's kind of what the novel's about, through the timelines, those connections. So I've just really enjoyed it, is what I'd say, and I really hope readers enjoy it too.
Good sentiments there, and yeah, here we go. I'll add my outro into the end of this. It has been lovely talking to you today, Amanda, and you've put up with my internet issues, which has been, thank you very, very much. Yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for your book.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Thank you.
Links to purchase The Midnight House are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed our conversation, do subscribe or follow the podcast on your listening app of choice. The Wormhole Podcast episode 63 was recorded on the 23rd of May and published on the 27th of June 2022. Music and production by Charlie Place.